There we go. So we're going to talk about React portals a little bit. If you don't know what those are, don't worry. They are still relatively new to React. I think they've kind of been out for a while, but I don't see them out in the wild that much. So this is kind of taken straight from the React docs. The React docs have a pretty good breakdown of what React portals are, but essentially it is if I want to break something outside of the DOM hierarchy. So, and the way to do that, you just React DOM, create portal, you pass it in a child. The child is just the thing I want to create. And then the container is somewhere to mount that, some element where you want that child to live. So a little bit more of like, okay, so what is that? Why would I use it? Where would I use it? So because portals break you out of the DOM hierarchy, you use that for a lot of things that visually on the page don't follow kind of that top to bottom, just semantic HTML, right? So let's say a modal, right, that pops up over the entire screen, that may live within a component. And instead of writing that modal logic way over here and triggering it from this child, you can just write that in line where it makes sense, and then put it into the DOM wherever you want, like onto the body. So hovers, loading screens, things that break out of the natural flow. Portals are a kind of really good use case for that. Some caveats with it. Your event bubbling is all the same. So everything's still going to bubble up the regular like React tree. And that's just because in React, it's still going to show wherever that code is written. But in the HTML, in the DOM, it's going to put it wherever you specify. So those kind of don't sync with each other. So event bubbling is going to stay the same. Re-rendering, stuff like that's all going to fall in line with wherever it's living. And yeah, the other key point that I always forget is like you have to specify a place for it to live. It doesn't default to like the body, which I guess I think it should, but I'm sure there's way better reasons why it shouldn't. So there is a GitHub of all the code that we'll go through. So if you want to look at it, if you want to follow it along, if you want to try and, you know, build a little portal, then you'll be able to do that. So we're just going to build a modal, and we're going to build it so that we can pop up the modal within a container and then use that same component to pop a modal that will take over the entire screen. And it's just going to be a reusable modal component. You could use it for any type of modals that you want to do in your app.
On that note, we've got Wi-Fi info. It's kind of small, these white pieces of paper. If you want to, if you'd like it. Does anyone want it right now? Yeah, okay.
That's about. All right.
I know, very, you know, Microsoft Word doc. Pass it around.
So we're going to kind of look at the code that we're going to write, and then we're going to kind of write it just so we can kind of step through what we're going to do. So I guess before that, I do have a bit of the project set up. So we've got just a simple create React app, right? App, all it does is render out this card component. This card component.
Pull that up.
Yep, thank you. Oopsies. There we go.
One more. Maybe
That's, yeah. Go to there. How's that?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Let me do this real quick. We'll just start up the dev server so that we can see what we're going to start with, what we'll be working with. I'll also blow this up. Okay. So it just says, welcome to React portal. Some of that documentation that we already went over. 2 buttons, open up the modal, and at the end of the day, we want that to open it on the body and then open it within the card. Right now, those don't do anything. They just console log. So if we go back and look at the code, so we've got that card component. It's just some HTML, and it's got those 2 buttons down here. Whoops, we don't want that. And then we've also got, and they've all got just their CSS is written already. Okay, we've got a modal component. I did some of the basics in here just to get it started. All it is, regular old component, got a container that's got a button in it, and then that renders children. So whatever you pass into it, we'll render it within here. And we'll get to see exactly how that is used, but that's all that component is. Okay, then we've got our portal, which is empty. Since that's the main one that I want to focus on, none of that's written. Okay, and so those 3 pieces are going to work with each other, right? The card is going to have the modal live in it, and the modal component is going to be wrapped by the portal. So portal is going to control where the modal is showing up in the DOM. Okay, that's all the portal is doing. Where is this going to show up in the DOM? So we will take a look at that. So we're going to go ahead and just create a basic portal just to get going. The code to do it, pretty simple. We're going to create a portal. It's going to take in children. Children's just what do we want to be rendered in there. So we're going to pass the modal into it. And then where's that going to live? The way we're going to do this is we're going to pass in an ID, and then we're just going to query select for that ID. So I could just say, hey, the body, right? And attach it to the body, or we can say, hey, attach it to the card or wherever. But that's not very flexible. Like I said, I don't want to also pass in like an ID every time for like a loading, for a lot of like dialogue popovers. Those are just going to be on the body. And so we're going to create this little helper function that's just going to create a div for us. We're going to set just an ID to it so that we can do this document.get element by ID later. And then we are going to append that to the body, and we're going to return that element. And that's the element that will render the portal with. So we'll come here, we'll create a component, okay, and we will also bring in create portal from React DOM. We're going to return create portal, takes in right children, and then we're going to do wrapper ID, and those are going to be props passed into the club. Okay, so we've got that. And then we're going to create our helper function, which is, I guess I should name it the same, create wrapper and append to body. Wrapper and append body, which takes in the wrapper ID. And then we're going to say, we're going to create an element. It's equal to document.create element. We're going to create a div. We're going to say element dot, oh, that's not what I want. Assign, let's look at the syntax. Oh yeah, dot set attribute. Yeah. So element dot set attribute. We're going to set the ID to the wrapper ID. And then we are going to just append it to the body and then return it. So document.body.append the element, and we'll return that. Okay. All right, so that should be everything there. So we now essentially can create a portal. We can default to just append it to the body. We now just need to add the logic to the portal saying, hey, search for that wrapper ID, whatever ID I pass in. If that doesn't exist, let's go and create it with that function we just made so that we can append it to the body. So you don't have to pass it in every time. It will just default to attaching it to body. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, we'll come in here. Let element equal get element by ID, wrapper ID. We're going to give this a default value of React portal wrapper. Okay, and then we're going to say, hey, if I don't have an element, then let's go ahead and grab it from here. It's equal to wrapper ID, and now we can pass in the element there. So now we've got a little bit of default stuff going on. This, for the most part, works. It's great. You don't have to do much more than that. We're going to add a little bit more flexibility to it, just to account for if the ID ever changes, then React will just update the portal, and we won't have to worry about something changing upstream and the portal not changing. So we're going to use a use layout effect that triggers on the wrapper ID changing. Using use layout effect instead of just use effect, because like the purpose of this is to add something to the DOM, so to change the layout of the page. And so we're going to use layout. The actual like differences and minute differences of them and when to use one or the other, the rule of thumb I just go off of, like if I'm affecting the layout directly, I use layout. The actual technical reason, I don't know. So I'm sure there's multiple of you in this room that know the answer to that. So I don't. So let's go ahead, and everything that has to do with the wrapper ID is going to get moved into a use layout effect for us. This is the, we'll get past, this is kind of the slow part, right? And then it will all start to connect a little bit. So we are going to trigger this on wrapper ID. Okay, and then we are going to move this code all in here. Also going to have a use state. Okay, and we are going to call this wrapper element. Start off as null. Set wrapper element to element. And then now we're going to use wrapper. So again, this is pretty much doing all the same stuff.
Sorry, can just, I'm trying to understand, if you use React Portal and you were using that same component for, I don't know, an alert, why would you change the wrapper? I didn't understand that part. Why would you, if you rendered that alert once and it was still mounted, why would you want to change its container?
So it would be in that case, this is pointless. This is more just to account for, since I'm just trying to build it in the most reusable way, so that if somebody is using the same alert or same dialogue, and for some reason, like changing it to be like, oh, instead of mounting it here, let's just mount it here. Yeah, trying to account for that as best I can. So
Moving it like it's like transitioning it from one location.
yeah. So I toyed around with and without this. And yeah, I did some reading on just examples of a lot of people on, okay, if they're going to create a reusable modal and with React Portal, I would say a good handful will do some sort of wrapping like this to be able to account for updates. And I read through a bunch of like their reasoning as to why. I was like, okay, does that actually happen though? Because isn't it just going to re-render anyway? Like if it changes, the whole thing's going to re-render. So like, is it really doing any good? I was like, well, again, people smarter than me are doing it in a lot of places. It doesn't hurt. But yeah, it's definitely not a needed, especially if you already know I'm only going to use this one place. I'm not going to be changing mid like alert where it's living. Then I don't think there'd be much use for it. That answer?
Yeah, I think so. I think if I mounted an alert in the body and I wanted it to, I'm thinking of like a walkthrough of an app, and I'm saying, hey, look at this particular location. Use that exact same thing, and you wanted to animate it to the right side. I wouldn't want to actually change the container. I would only want to be changing its, transition styles, or basically, manually moving the pixels across the screen rather than unmounting it and putting it inside of the new DOM. But I'm not sure if that's possible. Like I don't know if you can preserve state while it unmounts and moves into a different container.
Probably not in our setup, but you would probably just have to hold state in a either more localized place or something like that. Yeah. Okay. Good. Any other? Sweet. Now that we're doing this, wrapper element is going to be null to start. So we're just going to add a little check here. It's not return anything if that's the case. So we're handling that now. The last thing is be a good citizen and clean up after yourself. So if we do attach something to the body of the DOM and then we unmount this component, we need to go and remove that element that we manually added to the DOM because we don't want to dirty it up. We don't want to keep adding a bunch of stuff. So in the return of a use effect is essentially your unmount hook. And so we're just going to say, hey, did I create something? If so, go and remove that from the DOM. So keep it clean. So we're just going to do that right here and do a return here. System created, which we will just set that as a flag up here. System created false. So if we get into this create wrapper, that means we're creating something ourselves, right? So we're going to say, yep, we created something. And then if we look at that code, we're adding it to the DOM here. And so then we want to say, if we did that, we want to grab the element parent node, remove child, and we'll remove that up. Which it seems weird to like use the element to grab the parent to remove itself, but I guess that's how you do it. So now that should, if we add anything to the DOM, we should clean it up after ourselves. And that should be about it. We have a portal, it's reusable. So let's go ahead and move on and build out the modal. So I already have this part in there because I didn't want to take too long building out too basic of stuff. So just a modal component. I do have some basic like role, it's an alert dialog, it's a modal, ARIA tags. I'll have a slide towards the end on some accessibility considerations and concerns about like rolling your own modal versus like just using a library or like a native alert or something like that. Because there are a lot of accessibility concerns. So we'll get to some of those in a minute. Actually, we'll get to one of them right now. So one, I recommend if you're going to make a modal, go read some documentation on what the accessibility requirements are. One of the major ones is like being able to keyboard navigate, escape, close it with your escape key. There's all stuff on it. Should be focusable. It should autofocus on an action within the modal. When you close it, it should remove focus back to what it was before. Everything behind the modal should be disabled to screen readers and all that fun stuff. So we're not going to account for that here. But just know if you're going to do something like this in a production environment, accessibility should be important to you. And so those are some of the things to think about. And we might go ahead and we're just going to maybe skip this, or I might just copy and paste it in. But all this is creating a function that says, takes in an event. If the key was the escape key, then call the close function. Otherwise, don't do anything. And we just add that event listener. And if it gets unmounted, we remove that event listener. So that's all that is, and that gets added here. I'll just spare us from finding it all. Oh, actually, I did have it written there, just minimized. So there you go. That's what our modal looks like now. Okay. Oops. Next up, let's go ahead and use this. Now we can actually see everything that we built, see it come to life a little bit. We're going to go to that card component. We're going to render the modal, and we're going to, when you click on that button, we're going to set show to true, and we'll look at it. So let's see if we wrote any bugs. So got here, I'm just going to go ahead and add the modal here. Doesn't really matter where we do it. I'm going to then say, let's do this. I am the modal. Okay, so we got a modal. Forget to import it. And then we are going to, on click here, set is open to true. Is open is set to open. Okay, I already have that state up here. So we've got just a simple Boolean state flag. Is it open or not? If I click on this button, set it to true. The modal does have a handle close function. And so all we want handle close to do is set is open to false. Okay. So we're here. And sweet, we're opening a modal. But let's go ahead and look at this and see where this is living. So this is living right under the footer, right where we put it, right? And if I moved it up to the top, right? Then we would see, if I'm a liar, it's now at the top, right? So it's living where we put it in the DOM, which is great because this one's showing up within this card, but maybe this is a modal that's like a global alert. I want it to take over the entire page, and it doesn't make sense for it to live within the card if it's covering the entire page. And there could be multiple cards on this page or and other pieces of information that it's going to cover up. So that's where React Portal comes in. So we built our portal, but we're actually not using it anywhere. So next step is let's go ahead and actually use our portal, which will be super easy. All we're going to do is wrap the modal in React Portal and pass it a wrapper ID, a place of saying, this is where I want you to mount, where I want you to live. If I don't pass anything, it's going to live at the body. Or if I pass it something that doesn't exist, then it's going to create an element with that ID on the body. Or if I pass it something that does exist, then it's going to mount it wherever I tell it to. So all that setup work was to make this hopefully easy. where all we have to do is import our portal. Come in here. Whoops, React portal. Put everything up inside of it. Okay, and then that takes in a wrapper ID. Target ID. Okay, we'll accept a target ID now. Okay, so I'm obviously not passing anything in right now, and I can let's do this a default. Let's call it default modal container. Okay, so I'm not passing in a target ID where we're rendering it. We're just passing in these props, which means we're going to default to this string for our ID. That'll get passed in here as the wrapper ID. We're going to say, does that exist anywhere? It doesn't in the DOM. So it's going to create a new element for us and append that to the body. So if everything worked correctly, now when I open it, that overlay is now shadowing everything, and the modal is actually down here. So we can see our card, close that, div, and this is body. It's at the very end of the body. So we've taken, this code lives within the card and said, but you should render out here. Really nice, because this modal might have, like, the content of it is related to the card, so it makes sense to build it there, but I can present it anywhere I want. So really cool. We
Awesome.
built a modal. So last thing that we'll do to it, we'll do like two little things is, okay, now I can use that same component and have two buttons, one that should open it within the card and one that should open it on the entire body. So we'll go ahead and do that real quick. So the way that we're going to do that, we're just going to change our open on body. We're going to set the wrapper to, or the ID to something that doesn't exist. And when we want it to open on the card, we'll pass it card. And if we look at in here, we've got the ID of card, right? So if I pass the target as card, it's going to say, hey, render it within this component. So we're going to then say, hey, open this on the body. And we will then pass this one, open card. And now, oh, not working. One, let's pass in the target ID is equal to target, and I don't know how to code. So
Yeah, invoke your click handler. You've got an arrow function in your click handler. That does
did you ever, I didn't delete the arrow. Yep. That's what it was. There we go. All right, so open on the body, overlaying everything, same thing, now only overlaying the card. So highly reusable, can do this anywhere and fit to the content that you want. The last little pieces of niceness that I like to add to it, add some CSS transition. Essentially, the only difference, it's kind of small, is we just wrapped it in a CSS transition that comes native with React Transition Group. So I guess it's not native with React. And that just adds like a little nice slow animation in, slow animation out. And then the other things to do with accessibility. So I'll show you a little bit of an example of what this looks like in a more production-like environment where it's all the same thing. So for here, right, we're now just grabbing, if I click on the overlay, you're right, I want to be able to close it by clicking on the overlay. I want to set everything that's behind it to hidden. I also want to, so there's the close overlay, if it's dismissible or not. There's the escape key to close. Initial focus when I open it, so that if you have like an accept or a decline button, whichever one I want to initialize focus on, you can specify. Your focus gets trapped in there, so if you keep pressing your tab, it just cycles through your modal and it doesn't go to the content behind it. We've also added like a scroll lock to this and a bunch of other stuff. So those are some of the things to consider if you're going to do this at a more large scale. But for the most part, all we did is create a little wrapper that we can specify where we want to mount something, simple modal, and then we just trigger it and it opens. So yeah, that's how you create a modal with portals. Any questions?
So you talked about accessibility and maybe everything's just fine. So I'm thinking like semantic HTML, like everything in order, and there's a lot of structure to how that works and whatnot. As soon as you start rendering things in random other places, it's probably okay, because really all you're doing is changing where the logic to trigger it is, right? You're still kind of choosing where it renders. You probably have control over that, but is there anything that, like, I don't know, it's probably harder for the developer to be accessible aware because they're rendering something outside of their tree, or maybe it's not, but your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so one, there's a lot of different like ARIA labels and tags to help with that. So for example, like role, alert dialog, ARIA modal. If you open this as a alert dialog, that's like essentially the tag saying, hey, I'm gonna like open something that's disruptive and like let the user know, hey, this is essentially a pop-up and you're stuck here until you do whatever it says. So that's some of the ways that you handle it from like a user's accessibility standpoint. I think from like a developer in terms of like maintainability, it's nice to keep things where they live. Like, let's say this is like a checkout form. And then the modal is a pop-up that says like, are you sure? We will charge you $322. Do you want to proceed? And it makes sense that it's like, well, this is the form where like or like the checkout cart, right? And it tells me everything I'm buying. And when I press submit, it pops up a modal of the total that was in here. So it makes sense that it lives here, but it pops up like it's over the whole screen. So I think it depends on what you're using it for and making sure that that code just like lives next to what makes sense. I don't know if that's answering kind of what you're
Sure,
saying.
yeah. I guess I'm thinking more, so modals are pretty easy because it's very disruptive. You can just like blanket say everything else doesn't matter and put me in front and whatnot. I guess I'm thinking beyond that of if you used it for anything else other than an alert or a dialogue.
Like a hover tooltip.
Hovers, or even like, I mean, there's no limit to what you can do for portals, right? You can literally just render something else in the footer or something, right? And
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think at that point, yeah, you could probably get to a place where it's like, now we're just like manually telling stuff to pop instead of just use semantic HTML. Make sure you structure it so that you're not having to like force things to live places. Yeah. Any other questions?
In your React portal, there's a warning there. I'm probably,
The lint warning.
yeah, it is
Okay.
mainly because the way that you are structuring, you're having just a variable that is like system created.
Mm-hmm.
And then every time that renders, the system created is going to be false every time. So the only way to React knows how to handle that variable is going to be via a ref. In that way, it knows the next time that it renders, it knows what is going to be the previous value.
having it inside probably works too.
This is where it was supposed to live.
Mm.
It was also just within it.
Yeah, that works too.
But yeah,
To RJ's point as well is the most uses that I've seen in Create Portal is within a web component. So since you can pass anything in the wrapper element, you can pass also a web component. And the web component is not part of the real DOM. It is just another different thing that is inside of there. So that's probably one of the useful things about portals that you can point anything in the DOM, even if it is outside of the real DOM environment.
That's cool. Yeah, I haven't ever done that or seen that. So yeah, it's very flexible. Allows you to do a lot. Sweet.
Did anybody use this before? Portals? Have a few? I haven't. I was fascinated by this. This is really cool.
I've never used the web component. You're saying you pass a React component inside a React?
So
Web
you
web
have-
component is different than a React. It's like
Yeah.
That's what I'm asking. I've never seen React portal used for web components.
Yeah, so you have your web component right in the tree. So you can open a portal inside that web component by pointing out to that ID of that web component.
And they'll
It is
render the React
inside of
inside of
that.
that component. Interesting. Yeah.
I'm reading on web components. I don't know what those are, so.
It's.
NDN is
Dark
really long.
Yeah, you don't want to go there.
Dark magic, okay, that's,
They can be really powerful for that kind of pattern where not everything is React and you want to share them to people that may or may not be using React and stuff. And even if they are, then you might have different like enclosures within it. It's almost a safer iframe kind of. I don't know, there's a lot of patterns with web components in React using that pattern that can be pretty powerful for, especially for like multi-tenant teams building on the same page and things like that. It can get pretty powerful.
I think you're right on the dark magic. MDN says shadow DOM right inside of it.
Yeah.